Okay, welcome everyone to the launch of Sex Beyond Yes with Quill, our Kukla, and Avgi Saketopoulou. You clap now. My name is Greg Newton. I'm the co-founder, along with my partner, Donnie Jokum, of the Bureau of General Services Queer Division, which is where you are right now. So the Bureau is an independent, all-volunteer queer bookstore that Donnie and I founded in 2012, and that has been here at the LGBT Community Center since 2014. Tonight we're being helped by our volunteers Anna and Brendan, so please thank them for their service. And as an all-volunteer queer bookstore, that's right, I'll be passing a bag for donations. We are now paying rent at the center against our will. Speaking of consent. So we desperately do need help with monthly donations, if you're able to do that. So I'm passing a bag for donations tonight, that's great. But if you're able to sign up to become a monthly donor, there's a QR code for that on here, or you can go to our website, bgsqd.com, and you can sign up to donate any amount. That just helps us to have a reliable source that we know we can count on. But buying books, making donations, all of it helps. So thank you for whatever you're able to do. There's also a Venmo code on here. Oh, if you're doing the monthly donation, it's also tax deductible. The Venmo, not so much. So let me pass that around. And if you're not already on our email list and you'd like to be, you can sign up for that at the back of the room or on the website, bgsqd.com, and you'll get an email every other Monday about our many upcoming events. And I don't think I mentioned our hours yet, but we are open Wednesdays through Sundays from 1 to 7 p.m., and then we often stay open later when we have events such as this. And today you're getting a preview of Fight the Power, 15 Years of Homocats, which we'll be celebrating the opening tomorrow night, but you get to see it right now. So yes, we're happy to have Jay Morrison as the artist, Brooklyn-based artist, who's been producing the Homocats for 15 years. So Fight the Power indeed. Before I introduce Quill and Avgi, I wanted to read a land acknowledgement. So the Bureau acknowledges that our organization operates on the unceded land of the Munsee Lenape. We encourage you to join the Bureau in signing up to make a monthly donation to the American Indian Community Houses Mannahatta Fund. The Mannahatta Fund, according to its website, is an invitation to all settlers and non-native people who wish to acknowledge the legacy of theft and genocide that comprise the history of New York City and the United States. And you can find out more at mannahattafund.org. The Bureau also recognizes Palestinian liberation as a fundamental part of our collective queer liberation. And we encourage you to take one of our free zines that are up by the register and take it, read it, share it. It basically lays out why we feel it is important for queer people, especially, to speak out in solidarity with Palestinians, and especially now. So please take those and share them widely. All right, let me introduce our speakers. Quill, our Kukla, lives in Washington, D.C. and Berlin. They are professor of philosophy and disability studies at Georgetown University and the editor-in-chief of the Kennedy Institute of Ethics Journal. They are also an amateur competitive boxer and power lifter, the parent of a young adult, and the devoted caretaker of a corgi and 2 cats. This is their 4th book. Avgi Saketopoulou is a Cypriot and Greek psychoanalyst in NYC and a member of the faculty of NYU's postdoctoral program in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. She is the author of Sexuality Beyond Consent, Risk, Race, Traumatophilia, and a lover of queers and motorcycles. Avgi is also the co-founder of P-Hole, an anti-racist, pro-trans, anti-Zionist, pro-sex worker, disability and economic justice initiative for psychoanalytic learning. Please give them both a very warm welcome. Feel free to take your
Okay, here we go.
Is this good volume for people? Awesome.
Okay, thank you, Greg. Thank you for welcoming us. Thank you all for being here tonight. I'm very excited to be in this conversation with Quill. Thank you for the invitation to have this conversation. We have planned some things that we're going to be doing today, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. But first, I want to start with a question to you, Quill. Tell us a little bit about why you wrote Sex Beyond Yes.
Okay, I will. Before I even do that, I just want to say this is such a delight. I'm doing a series of these, and all the spaces they put me in are at least a little bit queer, but wow, is this queer. This is so nice. I'm just enjoying it so much. It's very nourishing. And also, I've been extremely lucky in the sense that for each event, I've been thinking who would be my ideal discussant. And in most cases, my number one choice has said yes, and that was definitely the case for this one. Just like really thrilled that Avgi has agreed to do this, but that was not the question. Yeah, let me say a little bit about why I wrote the book. There were really a few very specific reasons. The first and most important one was, it seemed to me that almost all of the literature that was out there on sex, whether it was coming from the left or the right or somewhere else, tended to focus on how sex could go wrong and how it could be terrible and the ways in which it is distorted by patriarchy and how we can protect ourselves from bad sex. And there was very little out there about good sex. And I really in the first instance was committed to writing a book about good, fun, pleasurable, ethical sex. That's really what I wanted to write about. Which takes me to the second point, which is the title of the book. Which has a lot of meaning for me. The reason the book is called Sex Beyond Yes is partly because saying yes to sex is just not nearly enough to make it good. It's a minimum requirement at best, but it doesn't give us good sex. But also, there's just not that much in there, there's not that much out there about what happens after yes. I wanted to write a book about how we could have fantastic sex premised on the fact that everybody has agreed to it, right? Like, then what happens? I didn't feel like there was a lot of material about that. Another thing that mattered to me a lot when I was writing the book was that I felt like even stuff that was being written from a feminist point of view and that was very clearly aware of the existence of queer sex and aware of the fact that trans people have sex and disabled people have sex and older people have sex, still centered the kind of traditional heterosexual encounter as the thing that established our sexual imagination, right? So there was an acknowledgement that other stuff was out there, but the primary analyses still tended to center traditional heterosexual sex. And I wanted to write a book that just relentlessly refused to center that. I wanted to write a book that put at the center the fact that all different kinds of bodies have sex, all different kinds of genders have sex, people with radically different capacities have sex, radically different ages, radically different tastes. And I wanted to bring all of that into the center rather than just naming it as an exception. And the final thing that I would say is that as an academic philosopher, I've always prided myself on writing relatively clearly and colorfully compared to most academics, but it's still a very different project to write for other academics versus to write for the world at large. And I find the way that most academics write about sex, although Avgi is definitely an exception, to be kind of bloodless and kind of dry and abstract. And I am trained not only as a philosopher, but also as an ethnographer and a geographer. And I wanted to write a book that really drew on my ethnographic instincts as well, and brought in the time I've spent at sex festivals and kink clubs, and the time I've spent being friends with and talking to sex workers and sex educators and so forth, and just to fill the book with more messy narrative reality than you normally get from philosophers. And so that's what I hope that I've done. And I guess I'll stop there. That's a lot of reasons.
This is really great also because when you read the book, and I hope you all will, it's a really amazing book, like you actually sense that it's written from somebody who cares about these issues, like on a bodily level, on an emotional level, like it doesn't just feel academic or, I mean, aside from the fact that it evades the kind of like the obfuscations of academic language, it also is a book that really cares about sex, and you can tell that. Sometimes you read something and you know that the person who's writing is writing from within an experience, and that really makes everything different. But would you read a little bit from your book?
Yeah. Thank you. I'm hoping that later we'll wrap around and have time for another little reading, but for now I'm just going to do something very general. I'm going to read from the beginning of chapter 1 and from the beginning of the chapter 2 to just sort of set up for you the book. So this is from the start of chapter 1, which is called Beyond Consent. A young woman who thinks of herself as a feminist fantasizes about her new boyfriend tying her up. The idea of being helpless and at his mercy makes her feel sexy. One day as they're messing around, he takes out ropes and slowly begins to tie her with them. She's pretty sure he would stop if she asked him to or struggled, but she doesn't. He proceeds. She finds the whole thing a huge turn on, but also worries that her desire for submission and his desire for domination might both be sexist. She wonders why she wants this kind of play and why he does. An 87-year-old man with moderate dementia often forgets that he lives in a long-term care facility. Sometimes he recognizes his husband who comes to visit, and sometimes he does not. But when he has sex with his husband, he responds with obvious pleasure and affection, and he often asks for his husband when he's alone. Today, his husband asks him if he's feeling sexy, and he says yes, and they make love. After a lifetime of feeling unattractive and an evening of moderate drinking, a middle-aged man who has always been a bit of a loner is approached by a younger woman in a bar. She asks him if he wants to fuck her in the alley. He feels awkward and not really turned on, but he worries that turning her down would be ungrateful and unmanly. He also wonders if he'll ever get another chance for this kind of encounter, so he goes with her. Are these stories of good sex, ethical sex, consensual sex? Do the people in these stories have sexual agency? That is, are their actions in these situations self-determining, self-expressive, and not hijacked by anyone else's goals or desires or by manipulative social pressures? I expect that each of these stories will make readers uneasy. They are not ethically clean, and they might end up involving harm. At the same time, each of them has the potential to turn out to be a story about sexual joy and fulfillment. What more would we want to know about these people, their communication with one another, and their situations to decide if these are stories about sex going well or poorly? How could each of these stories above turn out to affirm or undercut sexual agency depending on the details? So many of our conversations about sexual ethics and sexual agency focus on consent. But notice that in these scenarios, whether everyone consented is not really what we need to know. It's already clear that in the first scenario, there was no moment of explicit verbal consent, but also that the woman does not try to stop her boyfriend from proceeding or show any distress. In the second scenario, knowing that the man with dementia said the word yes doesn't help much with our unease, which is about sense of self, competence, and vulnerability. In the third scenario, the man certainly seems to be acting under his own free will, but our discomfort remains. It's always necessary that everyone in a sexual encounter is participating freely and voluntarily. And of course, if someone makes clear that they don't want to participate in a sexual activity, then it's never okay to proceed. But the narrow question, did they say yes to sex, is not the most pressing one we need answered before we can judge whether the complex sexual encounters in these scenarios went well. Here are some different questions you might have about the people in the opening scenarios. How long have the young woman and her boyfriend been together? And how good is he at reading and responding to any signs she might give that she's uncomfortable or wants to stop? Did he already know that she fantasized about bondage? Do they have a sexist dynamic outside of the bedroom? Can they talk to one another about their desires and how these might play into gender stereotypes? Could she easily and safely leave if she wanted to? Does she have a community with which she can talk about her feminist qualms with bondage and her attraction to it? Or would she be slut-shamed or called out as a bad feminist for bringing the topic up? As for the older man with dementia and his husband, how good is the visiting husband at understanding and respecting when his partner is aware of his surroundings and able to make decisions, and when he isn't? Does this long-term care facility support its residents' sexual desires and agency? Or does the couple have to sneak sex on the sly? Is there a support team who can give medical advice about his state of mind and who will provide help if anything goes wrong? And finally, when it comes to the man in the alley, does he find the encounter thrilling and affirming or depressing? How drunk is he? Does the woman treat their encounter as a fun adventure, or does she ultimately humiliate him? He chooses to have sex even though he feels ambivalent, but does he also feel like he could choose otherwise? If she harmed him, would he be too embarrassed to get help? Does he treat her well? Whether these are stories of good or bad sex, ethical or exploitative sex, free or unfree sex, depends on all these details and more. This is a book about good sex. I want to explore how we can expand and protect our own and one another's sexual agency and pleasure, and enjoy wanted, satisfying, ethically sound sex. Although some people are asexual, that is, they do not experience sexual attraction or desire, sex is a basic and important source of pleasure, fulfillment, and self-expression for most people. A society that supports human flourishing will make opportunities for people to access sexual pleasure and exercise sexual agency in safe and ethical ways. At the same time, sex is an arena in which people are vulnerable and especially open to exploitation, injury, coercion, and other kinds of harm. Protecting ourselves against bad sex is central to enjoying good sex, and an ethics of promoting sexual pleasure and agency can never be fully separate from an ethics of avoiding sexual violation and harm. So this book will discuss both good and bad sex, sex that goes right and sex that goes wrong. But while I will not avoid or deny the reality and seriousness of bad sex, sexual assault, and rape, I want to focus first and foremost on sexual pleasure, sexual agency, and sex that goes well for everyone. And now I'm going to do just a shorter reading from the beginning of chapter 2, which is my chapter on sexual talk and sexual negotiation. You and your friend are traveling together in a new city, and you decide to take a long walk to explore. As you go, you say things to one another such as, "Hey, that's a cool looking alley, let's take a detour down it, okay? This street is kind of boring and trafficy, not as good to walk on as we thought it would be. Let's pick another route. Can we stop in this bookstore for a few minutes? Let's find a nice place to stop for a coffee break. And importantly, I'm getting tired and my feet are starting to hurt. Can we jump on the subway and go home soon?" Unless you are especially passive-aggressive and a bad communicator, you don't just hope that your friend will pick up on your subtle body language if you eye that appealing alley or coffee shop longingly, or start performatively limping a bit to indicate that you want to go home. You won't start your walk by saying, "Will you take a walk with me?" and then just assume that if your friend says yes, they're stuck with whatever kind of walk comes next for however long you feel like walking. Instead, you set some loose provisional goals with your walking partner in advance. You agree that you have a few hours free to walk and that you'd like to explore a particular neighborhood and get lunch somewhere along the way, although you can always change that plan if something more fun pops up or if the original plan turns out to be less fun than you expected. It makes sense to tell your friend from the start if there's a gallery or a taco truck that you've really been wanting to make it to, or if you have an injury that means you need to walk a little more slowly than usual. It would be bizarre to think that such conversations kill the vibe of the walk. I have to interrupt and tell you that the first event that I did was in Amsterdam, but the discussant that I had was Finnish. And when I finished this reading, she was like, "Wait, but Finns don't talk." It would absolutely kill the vibe of the walk. So, okay, this is not culturally universal, but hopefully it still works. Okay. It would be bizarre to think that such conversations kill the vibe of the walk. It would also be bizarre to spend the walk barking formal requests and permissions at one another and imposing a lot of rules. Are you willing to turn left here? No. No walking after sundown. Okay. Can we keep walking? Yes. This kind of rigid exchange of requests and responses is not how we enjoy a walk together. But that doesn't mean we should walk in silence. All this talking, setting some goals, making some suggestions as you go, maybe mentioning some constraints, checking in, adjusting, building a rhythm and a route together, making sure both of you are still happy to keep walking, helps the walk be a good and interesting joint activity. Likewise, good sex often involves a lot of talk. When we have sex, we want to be able to set some shared expectations, but also explore some surprise alleys and stop for some unplanned treats along the way. There's an idea in broad circulation that a lot of talk leading up to or during sex is burdensome because it's unsexy or breaks the flow. But this idea is rooted in the traditional consent framework. People imagine that chatty sex would consist of constant requests, consents, and refusals. This would indeed be super annoying and unsexy. If you're finding that talking before and during sex kills the mood, you need to practice your sexy talking skills, not just stay quiet and hope for the best. A lot of our communication leading up to and during sex is not verbal, and this is appropriate. We use our bodies and our eyes to invite, to show pleasure and displeasure, to suggest, and more. I'm interested in all the communication that goes on around sex, but talking is an integral part of that, and talking is far from inherently unsexy. I'll stop there for now.
These are two really amazing examples of, like, each book, I should say, starts with these vignettes that then get used in order to flesh out the concepts in the book. And in fact, when Quill and I met, we met at a conference where I heard you give a paper that I think uses the vignettes from the 5th chapter.
From the ambivalence chapter, yes.
So, like, it's a mode of Quill's that felt very wonderfully familiar when I was reading the book. But I wanted to kind of like make a few comments and then say, kind of like ask you a couple of questions, because the range of questions that you come up with, like especially like if you're thinking about the first vignettes, the kinds of questions that come up are not of the sort we're usually thinking of associating with consent getting, right? And this idea that talking is not just part of the negotiation, it's also part of the sex.
Yes.
I'm thinking there's this psychoanalyst, like psychoanalysis is constantly worried about what happens with the erotics in the consulting room, and there's this psychoanalyst, Muriel Dimond, who says, sex talk is sexy talk, right? So the more you talk about sex, the more sexy things become, depending on how you talk about it.
Right.
So I really like the way, and I think it's a really important point, that flirting is the way we ask questions of each other during sex, the way we tease each other during sex is part of sex and part of consent, which I think is a really important point, and moves it away from this kind of like dry, boring, as you say, but also kind of like dispiriting. Sometimes I feel like people who have come up with these consent models really don't like sex. Because if you like sex, how would you ever be having a conversation like that?
Right.
So there's a level of nuance and detail, kind of like getting into these vignettes that I really love. But I also wanted to ask you, because there's three, I don't know if you want to get into this now, but there's three, I should say one more thing. A lot of work on consent does the critical questioning mode of problematizing. But how do you know that this is ethical? What about this? What about that? One of the really interesting things about your book is that you actually give us answers. and that's always a risk, because it means that somebody gets to say, well, I don't see it that way, or I disagree. But every question that is asked has a proposition behind it around kind of like what would you think good sex is, how something could be resolved, like how questions of agency. And I think this is really unique and really interesting. But I wanted to ask you, like, one of the things that the book talks about is that there's a couple of different points that are always critical to thinking about whether an encounter is consensual. One of them is kind of like, can you get out?
Right.
Like the exit factor. The first one I think is, what is the first one? Choice. Did you have a choice? And what's choice? And we'll talk more about choice in a minute. But one of them is also good communication. And I've been wanting to ask you this for a while, because as a psychoanalyst, I also believe in things that we don't know about ourselves.
Yes.
And good communication relies on things that we know. Even if we assume that we are willing to share everything about what makes us anxious, what makes us shy, what makes us hot, like the things that we would like to, but we're too like embarrassed to admit. Even if we take away all of these limitations and somebody's willing to be entirely transparent about themselves, they're not transparent to themselves.
Absolutely.
So I'm wondering how do you think about that?
I love this question, and I take it we're gearing up towards the ambivalent stuff, but we're not quite there yet. Yeah. No, but first of all, let me just say, I entirely agree. So like one of my other hats when I'm not writing this kind of stuff is I do a lot of work on philosophy of language, and one of the things that I care most about in philosophy of language is pointing out that language is not a matter of transparently reporting our inner states. Language and communication are complicated, public, joint social activities, and we may think that we're perfectly good at just sort of translating what's in our head into our words, but as you said, we know that we're not. And that's not really what language does for the most part. So when I say that good communication is key, I really don't want that to be heard as good communication in the sense of perfect, transparent transmission of well-defined, determinate mental states, right? Because as we're going to talk about soon, right, I don't even think we always have well-defined desires, right? To me, good communication is much more about, are we doing a good job at socially recognizing and coordinating with one another in a way that is supporting one another's agency? And that doesn't always mean just like hearing literally what the other person is saying about what they want, right? It might be about creating through communication an atmosphere of play and safety, right? It might be having meta communication, not where we transparently report what we want, because we might not know that, but rather the kind of communication where we talk about like, what do I get like when I'm actually not happy, right? How will you be able to tell when we're having sex that things are going badly for me? We may know that better than we know what we want, right? Or what does it look like when I'm having fun? One thing I wish I had put into that walking anecdote that I gave lots of things that you might say as you're walking, but one thing that I forgot to add is as you're walking, you might also just engage like in joint appreciation. You might stop and be like, wow, that's a cool piece of street art, isn't it? Let's look at that for a while, right? So good communication can also be about like sharing, coordinating and sharing our attention together towards pleasure. There's so many things we can do, both verbally and non-verbally, in communication that make our joint activity one that is supportive of agency and genuinely coordinated and mutually recognitive, that is not just like giving each other nice, clear, definite information. So I really definitely agree with you. Yeah.
One of the obsessions of consent culture and consent literature is the question of like, does somebody have agency or not?
Right.
And one of the things that you do, which I think is really innovative, is to think about how to support each other's agency, and that this is something that actually emerges in the context of a sexual encounter, and this notion that you can nourish somebody's agency, or that good sex involves the nourishing, the expectation of your agency being nourished and augmented. Felt really interesting to me. Would you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, this is super important to me, because one of the premises of the book is that none of us walk through the world being perfectly autonomous deciders, choosers, independent agents. And not only do I think we don't, but I don't even think that's the ideal. I think like human finitude and vulnerability are who we are, not just like a failing of who we are. So for me, agency is not about just like, I'm autonomous now, I can do whatever I want, I can say yes or no, I can choose. Agency, like you said, is something that, I love how you put that, we nourish it in one another, but I would also say it's not just that we nourish it in one another, but we find ourselves in environments and contexts and communities that either nourish it or undermine it, right? So agency, and you were asking me before we started this event about my term scaffolding, right?
Yes, I wanted to speak about
yeah.
that.
I make a big deal in the book about how agency is always something that is scaffolded, which is to say we don't just like have it sitting inside of us. Our agency is held in place and supported, sometimes lightly and sometimes with a lot of work, by all of these different layers around us. It's how we communicate with our partner, but it's also how the space that we're in gives us possibilities for action, lets us leave, keeps us safe. It's about how our medical and legal and education systems either support us or undermine us in our agency. It's about whether we have communities that give us resources for talking and understanding what we're experiencing and turning to friends if we need help. Like, all of these are scaffolds. And strong agency for me is just not the same as strong independence or strong autonomy or transparent self-knowledge. Strong agency for me is about being self-expressive and self-determining because you're well scaffolded by all of these different interpersonal and social layers.
I mean, I really love this concept of scaffolding. I was talking to Quill about this earlier because part of what it does, which is that it takes sex outside of the dyadic, and kind of like helps you see all the multiple layers and all the multiple kind of like shadows of what goes into an interpersonal encounter that may look dyadic or triadic or orgiastic or whatever your number is, but it kind of like
octadic.
And you actually begin to see, and you flesh that out very well. And when you talk about scaffolding, how much else goes into the possibility of a yes or a no, or the allowing yourself to get into pleasure about something, knowing that if something goes wrong, there's somewhere to go to. Like in the first example that you were reading about, like the woman who wants to be tied up but worries about kind of like what would my feminist teacher say about it, what would my feminist superego say about it. That kind of like the question of whether you have kind of like other feminists to whom you can go and speak about this, whether there are available models instead of the paucity of models where you only have like one way of understanding feminism or one way of understanding kind of like what bondage is. There is a variety of possibilities from which you can actually like build something up for yourself. So I thought that scaffolding was really a very innovative idea.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and you need a feminist community, and you need like the right kind of feminist community with internal diversity too, right? I mean,
up to a point, no TERFs.
Yeah, that's a fake F. But yeah, so I really try hard in the book and in life to avoid academic jargon, but I'm going to allow myself one term for you because I think it's very useful here. Philosophers often talk about what they call hermeneutic resources. And hermeneutic resources means all that stuff out there in the culture, which is like the books, the movies, the literature, but also the jokes, the stories we tell, the conversations we have, the images that are out there, all of it, which provides us with material for making sense of our own experiences and our own narratives. And those hermeneutic resources can be toxic or helpful, they can be paltry or they can be rich. And if you don't have the hermeneutic resources to understand what would give you pleasure and what it is that you are trying to express when you're being self-expressive, or how you want to determine yourself when you're being self-determining, if those hermeneutic resources don't exist, it really limits your agency, right? Even if nobody's coercing you and nobody's manipulating you, there's just like less you can do. And so I think one of the really important things about having the right kind of community, including the right kind of feminist community, is just having rich hermeneutic resources, having a lot available to us. And one of the points I make in the book is that, one thing that I was really trying to push back against is the extent to which I feel like the topic of sex has somehow become a topic for women, like mostly for cis straight women. To me, the topic of sex is for literally everybody. But the reason I brought that up now is I think that for all that women face sexual violence and all sorts of distinctive harms, men have especially straight men, have an especially intense poverty of hermeneutic resources. They are given almost no material to have a sexual imagination, and almost no material to think about ways in which they're vulnerable, to think about what they don't want as opposed to what they do want sexually. So we need to do, a really important part of the scaffolding for me is like building up those hermeneutic resources for literally everybody. Yeah.
I mean, I actually see your book as part of the building of those hermeneutic
I hope
resources,
so.
in the sense that, you
hence
know,
the stories, yeah.
Yeah, like, because if consent only means one thing, then you don't have that kind of like variability in
Right.
being able to find resource in other things that exist outside of you.
Yeah, exactly.
And you also talk about scaffolding, and also in terms of like medical resources or legal resources,
Right.
or, you know, if you know that that you don't have money to take a cab to leave somebody's home.
Right.
If you know that you're more likely to be blamed, legally blamed or socially blamed for something, then that really constrains your sexual agency. That really takes the conversation outside of the encounter, but also shows how it kind of like casts its shadow on the encounter.
Exactly.
Which is great.
Yeah.
Do you want to do a little bit more reading, or?
Since we're talking about this,
Mhm.
yes, yeah. So to set this up, we had, like Avgi said, we got to talk about sex in Chicago a couple years ago, and when at that point I was talking about ambivalence, so she's familiar with some of my stuff on ambivalence, but I think it's really relevant here because if we put together two of the things we've talked about so far, the fact that we don't always know our own minds, and the fact that we don't always have the hermeneutic resources that will let us understand what it would be like to experience a thing, I think we often enter into sexuality and sexual encounters from a position of ambivalence. So that's just to set up this reading. I also, like I said, this one's a little long, so what time are we at?
What time are we?
I don't want to tax any of these patients.
47.
Oh, goodness. Okay, well, maybe I'll read this and then we'll do questions.
Sure.
Yeah, okay. Okay. I love hiking and I have great endurance. Oh, we started 10 minutes late. That's why this went so fast. Okay. I'm like, how could it's not possible. All right. I love hiking and I have great endurance, but I'm afraid of heights and prone to vertigo. You invite me on a gorgeous looking hike. I know it might be too much for me, but I also know that if I manage it, I will be super proud of myself and I will have a fantastic time. But I just can't tell in advance if it's going to be exhilarating, terrifying, or unmanageable. I'm an amateur boxer. I love fighting, but each time I'm about to get in the ring, I doubt my choice. I can't predict what will happen in advance. I can be pretty sure that some moments of the fight are going to be painful and discouraging. It's not like I'm going to get through the whole event without being punched. And fighting is risky. The whole thing might end with injury, humiliation, or both. But when fighting goes well, it's the most thrilling thing that I experience in my life. My partner wants to practice bondage with me. I know that letting them tie me up and suspend me would give them great pleasure, and the idea does interest me and turn me on a bit. But I've never experienced it, and I'm not sure if I might feel panicky or uncomfortable, or maybe even just silly once we do it. Honestly, I'm not sure how I feel about it. Each of these three scenarios is grounded in experiences from my life. In each, I feel ambivalent about whether I want to do something together or with someone else, both in the sense that I'm unsure whether I want to do the thing, and also in the sense that I'm unsure what the experience of doing it would be like. I don't know if it will be exhilarating, frightening, painful, embarrassing, pride-inducing, or some mix of these. In each case, I have to decide whether to participate in a joint activity with someone else that leaves me vulnerable to various kinds of physical and emotional harm, while at the same time giving me the possibility of joy, pleasure, and satisfaction. When I'm feeling unsure whether to go on the hike, what might my concerns be? I don't really know how scary or difficult the hike will be, or how I'll react to the challenge. But I also might be worried that I will disappoint or anger you if I bail on the hike in the middle, or that you'll try to pressure me into continuing. I might very well be concerned that bailing or showing fear will be embarrassing. I might also worry that I won't be able to turn around if I want to because it may be too hard to get back down. In the case of the boxing match, my concerns may be overlapping but also distinct. I might worry that I'm biting off more than I can chew. I could be injured or overwhelmed during the fight. Honestly, when I'm getting ready for a fight, I'm also always worried that I will be mocked or embarrassed if I can't make it through to the end. But I also worry about the referee calling the fight too soon. What if I accidentally look distressed or hurt or tired and the referee ends the fight or gives me an 8 count while I still have plenty of fight left in me? That actually happened. I recognize that I can never know exactly what to expect from my opponent. It's not like I can ask in advance which blows they intend to throw, nor can I insist that I be asked for verbal consent before each punch. That would entirely destroy the fun and the point of the match. Finally, what might my concerns be in the bondage and suspension case? I might not enjoy being tied up. It could be uncomfortable or claustrophobic or just not a turn on. I might feel quite silly once we get going. I might worry about the possibility of injury. I might be concerned that if I start to panic, it's going to be a difficult and lengthy process to untie me. I might worry about whether I will be able to speak up and express my needs if I want to readjust. If I express any displeasure or try to control what's happening, will it wreck the mood? As in the hiking case, I might also worry that my partner will be disappointed, angry, or frustrated if I want to stop. Some of these concerns, such as injury and physical discomfort, are specific to physically risky or edgy activities, but many of the others apply to any joint activity in which I'm not sure what it will be like, whether I will like it, how my body or emotions will respond, or how my partner will respond if I want or need to stop or redirect the activity. Any kind of sexual terrain can generate these sorts of concerns and this kind of ambivalence. Even if nothing kinky is going on, I might be ambivalent about having sex with a new partner, or having sex in a new environment, or even having sex for the first time. If you feel genuinely ambivalent, you cannot simply make and communicate an informed choice about what you want to do. In the situations I described earlier, my desires were legitimately unclear, unsettled, and indeterminate, and some crucial information about how the future would go was unknowable to me. I could not predict in advance whether I would feel vertigo, or how the fight would unfold, or how I would respond to being tied up. Ambivalence makes our autonomy imperfect, but perfect autonomy is not a realistic or helpful ideal. Many discussions of sexual agency insist that only fully informed, completely confident consent counts as consent at all. But full information and certainty of pleasure are just what we cannot have in these ambivalent situations. Sometimes consent is, I don't actually want to read that paragraph. I'm not going to read that paragraph. Importantly, enthusiastic consent is exactly the wrong standard in ambivalent situations. I am not enthusiastic or full-throated in my desire to participate in the hike, the fight, or the bondage. That's the whole point. If we require enthusiastic consent for all sexual activities, then we rule out doing anything we feel ambivalent about. But we do not demand enthusiasm as a precondition for action in other domains of life. Think how silly it would be to claim that you only count as proofreading your essay or washing the dishes consensually so long as you do so with enthusiasm. Or that you have to be enthusiastic about watching a television show with your partner on a boring Wednesday evening when you're both exhausted and out of ideas for what else to do. Or that you have to be super into having that wart of yours sliced off in order to consent to medical treatment. I may consent to going on vacation with a high-maintenance friend, even if I'm worried that it will turn out to be a mistake. We consensually do things that we're not enthusiastic about all the time. Why should sex be any different? In many kink contexts, where consent is heavily discussed and theorized, people like to define consensual sex in terms of fries. Consent is supposed to be freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, and specific. Kinksters love their consent definitions, and this is just one model among several popular ones. It's certainly true that consensuality requires that everybody must be participating freely without manipulation or coercion. As for reversibility, I, in fact, talk about that a lot later. But the other three elements of fries don't seem to work in the kinds of murky, ambivalent contexts I've described. We just saw that enthusiasm is not a reasonable prerequisite for sex. And we also saw that we cannot always be fully informed, because we may try something new and be unable to know how it will go or how we will feel about it. Sometimes, as in the boxing case, we can't be specific in advance about what we are agreeing to because surprise and imperfect control are built into the activity. As Catherine Angel puts it, traditional consent culture doesn't tell us how to cope with ambivalence. The idea that people should always clearly state their informed and enthusiastic desires is inadequate to contexts in which there's no full advance information to be had and no clear desire to be stated. The response to all this from someone who's a big Fries fan may well be, well, if you're so unsure about doing something, just don't do it. Ambivalent agency isn't good, strong agency. This idea that if either you or your partner are unsure, then you just shouldn't proceed is so common that I'm not sure means no makes it onto multiple memes and infographics about consent, as does the idea that consent requires an enthusiastic yes. A recent queer music and sex festival in Germany sported signs that read, "Push your look, not your limits." But this restriction would deal far too serious a blow to our sexual agency and our opportunities for sexual pleasure and fulfillment. More generally, our lives would be much less self-determining, empowered, and fulfilling if we simply steered clear of ever pushing our limits or ever doing things about which we felt ambivalent. The freedom to push our boundaries, explore our limits, and figure out what we enjoy and what we can achieve expands our positive agency. We just have fewer things we can do if we believe that we can't do anything that we're unsure about. And some of the things we feel ambivalent about we may well turn out to like or even love. We may discover talents and capacities we never thought we had. Our possibilities for intense and varied forms of pleasure and fulfillment shoot up if we sometimes take a plunge, even though we're uncertain. Even apart from this broadening of our experiences, pushing ourselves and taking risks is inherently agency expanding, not to mention exciting and satisfying. We often feel most empowered and perhaps even at our most self-determining when we are pressing on the edges of our comfort zone, rather than acting on our settled prior preferences. Taking a leap that pushes our boundaries isn't a diminished or partial form of agency. On the contrary, our ability to take such risks is often and especially intense flexing of our agency. Our world becomes narrow and restricted, and our agency atrophies if we never push our limits. This is true for life in general, for hiking and fighting, adventurous travel, becoming a parent, moving in with a partner, taking a challenging new job, and more. And it holds for sex as well. Our sex lives are much smaller with less possibility for fulfillment and discovery if we only do predictable things that we are already sure we will enjoy. We discover what we like and want by trying things out with the right kind of support, not just by being given the right to informed consent or refusal. This is why it's valuable to protect and scaffold people's ability to make risky choices in the face of ambivalence.
I can, but you said you.
Well, I forgot that we were 10 minutes.
Okay.
It's up to you. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Let me
We can do a
actually
little short.
ask.
Yeah.
Let me ask a couple of questions, make a
And then
couple
we'll
of
let-
comments, and then we'll open it up because I'm sure people will want to talk. I was thinking about kind of like. I'm going to start with like a short story. Like this summer, I was with my partner in Greece, where I love to hike and they love to hike, but we have very different relationships to heights. So you see like already how this connects. And we were going to a beach, and then we saw a gay couple, two gay men, a Greek one and a non-Greek one, having the fight that almost every Greek who has brought a non-Greek to hike in Greece has had, which is that the Greek is saying, it's fine.
Right.
It's like, it's gonna be okay, I'm here, I'm gonna help. And the other person is like, this is not fun for me.
Right.
So that example really resonated at a very personal level. But it also made me think of this, like you were talking about kind of like how the fear that you will disappoint your partner can make it hard to say no. And I was thinking also of what does it mean to then take the risk to disappoint somebody? That what consent involves is also the willingness to then bear the feeling that your partner wanted to do something and you didn't.
Yeah.
And that means that the encounter does not lead to you both feeling good, which doesn't necessarily have to mean that both of you will end up fighting or one person will pressure the other.
Right.
So I was wondering if you could also talk about consent in terms of like the responsibility that we take when we exercise our agency interpersonally, and the cost of that, the pain of that.
Right.
Because we are, I think you're talking so beautifully about kind of like what can come out of that.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also so many ways in which our no's or our hesitations, they don't just lead to punishments and bad situations. They can also lead to interpersonal difficulties and
right.
struggles, which of course are there in all relationships, right? So we don't want to imagine consent as just doing kind of like having like always the rainbow. I would love to hear you talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And I mean, I think it's like, it's important to remember that people are allowed to be disappointed,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, there's this kind of mythology around sex that, I want to be careful as I say this. It's certainly true that anybody gets to back out of sex at any time. And it's certainly true that the other person doesn't get to take themselves to have been wronged
Mm-hmm.
by the other person saying, you know what, I need to stop. And this works for hiking too.
Mm-hmm.
But the person who's been backed out on still has the right to be disappointed. And sometimes we act like that's, like they don't have the right to have that kind of vulnerability or those feelings. And especially when that's inserted into the traditional gendered patriarchal narrative, right? There's this idea that like men don't have the right to be disappointed if a woman changes her mind about sex, right? But again, it's not just about heterosexual couples or sex. So I think your question is a really deep and important one, because doing an intimate joint activity with somebody else collaboratively, which is what sex is for me, or with 8 other people, whatever, right? Nobody is invulnerable. We have this like asymmetric imagination of sex where like there's these men who just want sex no matter what, and then there are these vulnerable women and we're trying to keep them from being hurt, right? But nobody is invulnerable in this situation, and disappointment is a real vulnerability, right? Can I just say one more thing? Yeah, so I mean, I think what's important is to recognize that good communication and good scaffolding up front can lay the groundwork not to remove the possibility of disappointment or the possibility that it's not going to be fun and it's going to go wrong, but to remove other toxic layers that don't need to be there, right? So like in the chapter that I just read from, I talk about the use of safe words, and I talk about how useful safe words could be in the context of something like the hike, right? So if I said to my friend in advance, I really do want to do this, but I'm scared of heights, and just so you know, I might safe word out in the middle, right? She gets to be disappointed if I safe word out. But that's a very different dynamic, which is much more manageable than the dynamic where I'm like, where there's no safe word and I'm like, I don't know, I'm not feeling great about this, and she doesn't know if she's supposed to like encourage me or stop, right? And she's like, oh, don't worry about it, it'll be safe. It's like your Greek phrase, right? And then I have to be like, no, I really don't want to. And then it escalates to the point where now we're having a fight about it, and then she feels bad because now she feels terrible because she's made some, this is what actually happened, by the way. Nobody did anything wrong, but by the end I had to like literally shout at her, no, I want to go back, I'm scared, I'm leaving. And by then like there's a whole social confrontation, and then we have to go through all the layers of her apologizing, me telling her it's okay. Whereas just the contained dynamic of, I'm sorry, I have to safe word out of this, it doesn't take away the vulnerability, it doesn't take away the disappointment, but it does take away some of these other layers that can be like really hard to negotiate and just make everything worse.
I think this is like such, I'm so glad we're having this conversation, because I think that one of the problems that conventional consent discourse has, it imagines a consent diet as one person that has power and is invulnerable, and another person who doesn't.
Exactly, yeah.
And that means that kind of like saying in kick context, tops like never get to have feelings, never get to feel disappointed, like tops are like kind of like the all-giving mother that has to constantly be providing.
Right. So and we're always ready for it at every moment. Yeah.
Right. So there's something about this idea that, if we're going to take seriously, perhaps we're not talking necessarily about pickup scenes or like one night stands where kind of like the relational obligations are a little bit different than in ongoing relationships. Like the question of consent then implicates also what happens after the no has been said.
Right,
And
right,
how,
right.
and that is also the responsibility of the non-consenter, and not just the
Yeah,
responsibility of the
that's
person
right.
who has been said no to.
That's
Which
right.
makes this like much more interpersonally nuanced. So it can, like, I was actually hoping you were going to read this
Yeah.
example when you actually end up yelling at your friend, and then
Yeah.
you're like, I wish I had done it differently.
Yeah.
Right? So there's something like really fascinating about how to think about it this way. It takes us out of the either or of power.
Yes,
Which
I
consent imagines
absolutely
all the
agree.
time. And I think it's a huge problem, and it builds into consent negotiations. Like it builds into into them like a kind of a problem. It will eventually manifest. Like it builds a problem into them.
Yeah, and I mean, this is the problem. One of the many problems with the focus on yes or no is there are these simplistic digital responses. And I think that what you said is right, and we have a hard time hearing it. Like we have a hard time as a culture, maybe less so in a queer room or a room full of kinksters or whatever, but as a culture, the idea that the person who's saying yes or no, which we always imagine as the heterosexual woman who's saying yes or no, has a responsibility to do that well and to be protecting the agency of their partner when they do it is something that, because we've spent so long just trying to get across the message that they get to say yes or no, right? And have that respected, and we don't get past that point. But yeah, I mean, aftercare matters. It doesn't have to be this huge dramatic thing. Aftercare for me is just like, sex takes time, it's a narrative. Stuff happens before, stuff happens during, stuff happens after. All those parts matter to the agency, right? So how it ends and how you treat the person afterwards and how you communicate afterwards, that's all part of how well this is going. And the person who's saying no, or the person who's in the supposedly disempowered position, has just as much responsibility for making that go well as the other person. You're absolutely right, and that's something that we don't talk about very much. Yeah.
Shall we open it up?
I think we should.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
I certainly hope there are questions. Do we want the question askers to have, we don't care. Go ahead.
Yeah.
I'll project.
Okay.
And we can repeat also the
Yeah.
question for
Yeah.
the people who are watching online.
Well, I guess this is less of a question and more of like a thought, but I'm curious what your response is. I think it's so interesting and important how you're describing the shared vulnerability in all the partners that are involved. And I really like your framing of consent as being more about the conditions that are created than like the exact content that's happening.
Yeah.
And when I think about allowing people to be disappointed, I'm a therapist and in my first year of psychoanalytic training, I
Oh,
work
cool.
with a lot of couples. I'm always trying to encourage, like, let's allow this other person to be disappointed, but in the context of these conditions around consent, promoting agency, it makes me think about how people bear disappointment.
Mhm.
And how we think about, especially maybe men who are socialized to have not been given good tools for bearing disappointment or humiliation, and how that can like be transformed into something that might feel coercive or not promoting agency. And
Right.
I'm just curious about your thoughts on that and like
Yeah.
how that fits in.
Yeah. I do think that we haven't given, I was gonna say straight men in particular, but I'm not even sure I wanna limit it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we've done a very bad job of giving men tools for negotiating disappointment, particularly as a special case of the fact that we've done a very bad job of giving men tools at either being vulnerable or as seeing themselves, and this is something I spent a long time on in the book, and I feel like almost nobody talks about it, seeing themselves as sexually desirable in the first place, right? Obviously in gay men's communities, men see themselves as sexually desirable, although many gay men's communities, as we know, have very narrow ideas of what counts as sexually desirable for men. But in general, in terms of the sort of mythos of the culture at large, right? men and even little boys are given the message from right at the beginning that their bodies are laughable, their bodies are gross, it's okay to make jokes about how gross they are, that they're inherently predatory, and it's okay to talk about how people don't want them around or they're scared of them. And they're given the message that they're supposed to want sex all the time, no matter what, right, with no nuance. And we join that with not giving them any kind of toolbox for negotiating their own vulnerabilities or understanding how to share them with a partner. Like, so we spend a lot of this time talking about how this stuff is collaborative and we hold each other in agency and we hold each other in disappointment. We don't give men tools for doing that collaboration particularly well at all, right? It's not that women get such a great deal under patriarchy either, but you know, there is like all sorts of traditions out there of women running off to talk to their girlfriends about this, that, and the other. Like, men have this trifecta of, they're taught that they, because they're inherently undesirable and laughable, they need to find other ways of tricking people into having sex with them, either by offering them material goods or by coercing them or by somehow tricking them, right? And if they can get somebody to have sex with them, they're supposed to take it because they're supposed to want to be on all the time. And now in these days of consent culture, they're also not allowed to be disappointed if they don't get it, right? And if they end up coming out of this feeling like they are harmed or have self-esteem issues or are vulnerable, they don't have any, to use the term I introduced earlier, they're not given any hermeneutic resources for understanding that or sharing it with others. So I think it's like a fairly serious social crisis. And if we're going to try to be people who, you know, I said this book is really about good sex, not bad sex, but let's think about the fact that if we want to try to ameliorate rape culture, right, we can't do it just by telling men, like, don't be rapey. Right? We have to change all these background conditions to do with how both men and women are situated, both, and you know, whether straight or queer or whatever, how they're situated within all these norms of what their sexual imaginations are, what they're allowed to feel, how they're allowed to view themselves, and so forth. Yeah. More questions, please. Yeah.
I don't know how to make it a question, but I just like.
They don't have to be questions.
Yeah.
Just say things.
About bearing disappointment and how without the hermeneutic resources,
Yeah.
like, and one's own, I don't want to say pathology, but conditioning, perhaps, like the threat of self-attack when the message is, yeah, if you're unsure, say no.
Right.
I'm just thinking about that. The tendency to just how everything supports one, maybe blaming themselves.
Right.
Or I guess really blaming the other in the consent narratives.
Can you, would you mind, say a little bit more about the tie to the if unsure, say no, because I'm interested in that part, but that went fast for me.
Yeah. So say I took a risk.
Yeah.
But the narrative is.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Like the sign you saw in Germany. Like,
Right. Don't push your limits.
Yeah.
I see maybe means no around a lot lately.
Yeah.
As a philosopher who's very persnickety about the rigorous meanings of terms, I'm like, no, it doesn't. Those are two different words. There's a reason why we have both words. Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. If you're given this message of maybe means no, don't do anything if you're unsure, then you're absolutely right that it becomes like almost immediate to blame yourself if you did something that you're unsure about. And I think this gets back to something that Avgi was pushing, which is really important. We talked a little bit about disappointment, but more generally, right? The fact that things can be bad and not pleasurable. Yes, of course, we want harm reduction and we want to like take steps to try to generate pleasure rather than displeasure, obviously, but like that's not automatically a deal breaker. The world contains things that we decided to do that turned out not to be good. And sometimes we get hurt and sometimes we're disappointed, and sometimes we take a risk that doesn't pay off. And I think that there tends to be this kind of magical thinking around sex, where like we know that when we go to a movie, right? You go to a movie and you're like, well, I think I might enjoy it, but maybe it's gonna suck, but oh well. Something is really loud all of a sudden, I'm sorry.
I think it's upstairs.
Oh, it's upstairs.
Yeah.
Okay, good. As long as it's not me. Right? Like, stakes vary differently in different circumstances, but normally in life, we recognize that like you take risks, and then sometimes those risks don't pay off, and you have a really bad time, or sometimes it's like a really, really bad time. And that's not automatically a sign that you did something wrong or shouldn't have taken the risk, and it's not automatically a crisis either, right? But we've set up sex so that if sex goes badly, it's very hard not to feel traumatized and self-loathing and self-blaming, because we have this idea that you're only supposed to do sex if all of like these nice, neat conditions are in place. So we don't give ourselves that room for stuff that might just like be bad at the end. And I'm not saying yay bad sex. I'm just saying, like, I also really want to be careful, because I understand that because sex is so socially weighty for not just in our culture, but like in practically every culture, right? Because it's got so much social freight to it and it's so intimate. It's easy for things that go badly to really be traumatizing and feel like an extra lot of harm compared to like just seeing a bad movie. Although I've seen some traumatizingly bad movies. But we need to recognize that and make space for it, but not treat it like it's a necessary natural truth of the universe, right? Like, it's also okay to have sex and be like, well, that sucked. Turns out that was not the right choice, and that doesn't have to, and you can go on from that, right? So we need, and it doesn't mean you did anything wrong, and it doesn't mean that you somehow like put yourself in a position to be grey raped or whatever. It just, we need to make space for the fact that sex can be a high risk, high reward activity, and sometimes it's worth it doing the high risk, high reward thing, and sometimes we end up with the risk rather than the reward, and that's a reality that we need to make space for. But the reason I'm repeating myself a little bit is because I really want to be careful that I don't sound, in saying this, like I'm denying the reality or seriousness of sexual trauma. I think we can acknowledge sexual trauma, but also just be like that. It's not an automatic result of the fact that something didn't go the way that you wanted it to go. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I would add just one more thing.
Yeah.
Like when you're talking, Quill, about how it can go wrong, I think that where it gets, and perhaps you're also touching on this when you were pivoting around the word pathology, I think that sometimes when something goes wrong, you want to make meaning of it. You want to understand what happened. And sometimes you can stay with, okay, this didn't work, and I don't know what it's about. But at times the easiest thing is, well, you did this,
right? And
it's because of you, and because we partition consent with around the power, having or not having it, or who has the capacity, who's the like a victim perpetrator mentality,
right.
Then it can also more easily tip in that direction. So even if you're very thoughtful and very careful and do everything right or whatever, there's still a possibility that things will go wrong, and there's just nothing can control that.
Right.
And that applies for movies, for sex, for this talk. It applies for everything. And there's a degree of risk.
That's terribly wrong.
there's a degree of risk that you just cannot eliminate, no matter what your goodwill is, and that's just life. Again, I'm not trying to be like you were saying. Like, I'm not trying to be dismissive, but there's this tendency, I think, a lot in queer communities, that kind of like the notion of accountability can sometimes get overworked in that direction.
Can I just add to that? Yeah, I totally agree. And I mean, part of what I think feeds into that is this background. So one thing I talk about in the book is what I call the commodity model of sex, which is this idea that like sex is this zero-sum game, right? Like one person's trying to get it, the other person has it. You're like reaching a deal. And, you know, if you go to certain sorts of right-wing discourses, you'll see all this stuff about how, like, women are the ones who have the sex, they're supposed to keep it like a savings account and invest it so that it gets more valuable over time. But I'm not even kidding. They, like, literally say these things, right? So, but part of there's so many things that are creepy about that and so many things that are wrong about it, but one of the things that's creepy and wrong about it is it frames it from the beginning as this kind of antagonistic zero-sum game. So, within that framework, of course, if things go wrong, right, it's a quick leap from that to, I got a bad deal, I got ripped off, right? The commodity exchange didn't work in my favor. And that almost necessarily goes along with the blame thing that you're talking about, right? So as soon as you're thinking of it as this kind of antagonistic barter, it's almost impossible to escape from that kind of dynamic. Yeah.
First of all, thank you so much. This is such an exciting and rewarding talk.
Buy the book.
But one of the things that really jumped out that I appreciated was that I love the kind of conditions and conversations before the sex and after the sex, as well as during. Because I feel like often in like the rhetoric of consent, it just seems like there is no before. It's just like this kind of frame of like, okay, we're about to do it, but we have to go through this checklist, and it has to be perfectly answered in advance, and we have to be enthusiastic about everything in advance for it to occur. And I feel like what you're positing is like, but how do people try new things? How do people explore? How do you say like, I don't know, let's see. Like I feel like there's more room for like humanity, like less control. Because I feel like without that room, it feels like, how does anyone just play around? And I feel like that kind of gets lost. So I feel like you're breathing some like wonderful air into this conversation. So it becomes like it has all these other ways of communicating besides the verbal, besides the discussion in advance. There's more about tuning into people's body language, past history of how you know this person or not, ways that you know that there's safety, that there's pleasure. I mean, I feel like there's so much there that's very rewarding. So I just wanted to thank you for that, and wondering like, how did that emerge, this idea of like the before and the after, as well as the during? How did that become part of the thesis in your work?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I just want to point out that everything you said is right, but also the verbal stuff can also be play, right? It's not just the this comes back to the very beginning of what we were talking about, language is not just for trading information around, right? One of the main things we do with language when it's going well is we play with one another with it. And as Avgi said, that play can actually be not only like part of the sexual negotiation and part of what gets us in a sexy mood, but also part of the sex, because like the language is this incredibly flexible tool. And you're right that the conversation has been narrowed on these very, has been focused on these very rigid kinds of literal exchanges, but there's so much we can do with language that is building frames within which good sex can take place, and then being part of how good sex can take place. In answer to your specific question, and trying to hold myself back from going too much into my philosophy self, I've always been fascinated in many different domains with the fact that on the one hand, the things that we do that are meaningful are almost always temporally and spatially extended. That sounded really philosophy. They take place over time and in a place, right? Like that's kind of obvious when you think about it. And yet when we give like these abstract analyses of them, we tend to focus on these like pivotal moments taken out of time and place as if they're the measures of whether it's going well or not, right? And so there's been so much focus in sex education and in public discourse on, was there this moment, right, where this consent exchange happened, where the person agreed to sex, right, this asymmetrical thing. And I'm just in general interested in how those moments on their own are rarely meaningful, right? They're only meaningful because they're situated within something bigger. And one of the examples that I like to give to my undergraduates is if you just hear a note played it's literally not determinate what song that is the first note of until more notes happen, right? This isn't spooky, it's just a fact that that note could be the first note of this song or this song or this song. It depends on how it unfolds, right? So we don't know, we can't give meaning to these isolated events and expect to do all of our ethics and all of our politics and all of our social thinking by just trying to get these little isolated events exactly right. You have to see them as developing out of a temporally and spatially located narrative, being part of it, and then coming down the other side. Otherwise, we just don't understand the meaning of the thing. And that's a point that I care about when I'm talking about sex, when I'm talking about medical, like in all different domains. I think this is an important thing to remember. But yeah, thank you. It's a really helpful comment. Hey.
It's really great. My question is about problematic desire. So it seems
Yeah.
it's pretty clear to me that there are some sexual desires that are fairly problematic, say like racist desire.
Yeah, right.
Like, what do you think about the sexual agency of like people with those sort of desires? Like how should we go about scaffolding those people? Like,
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, and actually I do talk about that a little bit in the book, although probably not enough to satisfy you, but it is, I think it's a really important question. Two things. One is, this book really focuses on agency, but I always like to remind people that agency is not the only value. So a really problematic desire or activity might actually be fully agential, but still bad, right? Like, the agentiality of it is not the only concern that we've got. But a more interesting thing to say is, if we want to have positive agency and support people in their positive agency, how do we use that agency when our desires are problematic, right? Because there's two things that are clearly not possible. You can't, well, no, that's not quite what I want to say. One thing's clearly not possible. You can't just be like, oh, this is a problematic desire, so I'm not going to have it anymore, right? I'm just going to change my desires to the good ones. Because that's not how desires work, and that's not how voluntariness works, right? So you can't just like at will change your desires. I think that less obviously, it's also just wrong to think that we have no agency whatsoever when it comes to our desires. So much of this book is about imperfect scaffolded agency, right? We never are going to have perfect agency over our desires or perfect autonomy over our desires. We're never going to be able to just say, I should be the kind of person who wants this, this, and this, and hence now that's what I want. But that ideal of autonomy is what I'm fighting against in the whole book anyway. So we need to think about other more indirect, again, more scaffolded ways in which we can maybe not like radically overnight change our desires, but play with them and shift them. And I do think that there are ways to do that, right? So just to give a few examples, I think first of all, having communities where you actually can like do a good job of critically analyzing your desires so that you even know how to think about what's problematic about them in the first place matters. But then also we have control over our aesthetic environment to some extent, right? We can put ourselves in joyous, beautiful spaces where certain kinds of desires are celebrated that maybe aren't ours yet, but we want to tap into that aesthetics and that joy. And we can train up to, again, in a limited, imperfect way, we can train up our perceptions and our emotions by placing ourselves in new kinds of places with new kinds of people with new kinds of images. We can, when we recognize a desire is problematic, situate that desire for ourselves. We can do what some philosophers like to call genealogy. We can be like, what kind of story can I tell about how culture has unfolded where we've gotten to the point where I want this very problematic thing. That kind of like abstract discourse isn't on its own going to totally change your desires, but it's worth actually thinking about, right? Like we sometimes act as if the desires just show up in us fully formed, rather than thinking like, what's the history of this desire? What's the background set of stories that makes this appealing to me? And I could go on, but my basic point is, I think that there's really interesting conversations to be had, not about just like concentrating really hard and willing yourself to have better desires, but how can we as social, aesthetic, emotional embodied beings act differently and position ourselves differently in order to slowly shape ourselves into the kinds of agents we actually want to be, with the kind of desires we want to have, and how is that itself actually part of self-expression and self-determination?
I think this is a really interesting question. I'm going to take a very different path to it because I've written a book, 2 chapters of which is about race play.
It's true. She's got amazing stuff on this. You should. Yeah.
So I think that I think it's impossible. I think that it is important to not deny that desire is also conditioned by power in ways that can be both shameful but also very exciting. In ways that, like for example, the woman who is not sure if she should be wanting to get tied up. I think one way to look at that is kind of like this is a feminist thing to do. Another way to look at that, which is not mutually exclusive with the first one, is to say, how could that not also perhaps have like a swirl of kind of like an excitement with the power of the male and the submission of the woman to the man. So I think many desires are infiltrated, if not also commandeered, by social realities. And my worry about when we start legislating what desires are normal, I mean, I'm a clinician, this happens all the time. When we try to figure out what's moral and what's not moral, is that we may miss the fact that how people act on their desires, I mean, questions of mutuality, questions of participation are different than whether the desire is okay. Mm-hmm. So I interviewed a black man who identifies as a masochist and a race player and is one of the people who has kind of like written a lot and thought a lot about race play. And he said to me, in a way that I found really interesting, he said, I couldn't get a white woman to racially humiliate me. I would go to prodoms and I would say, would you shit on me? And they would say, yes. Would you call me the N-word? And they were like, that's beyond my principles. Mm. And you know, from a consent perspective, we can have this kind of conversation. But we also need to think about why somebody would do something terrible, socially terrible to another person, like shit on them, and what kinds of anxieties, racial anxieties, a white person might have that might actually keep them from doing the job that a prodom would do, where they might play with certain fetishes. So I'm not saying this to say, and therefore everybody should do that, whether they want to or not. And that's not the argument that I'm trying to make. The thing that I'm trying to say is that the idea that we can imagine desire to be unpolluted or unshaped by power and unshaped by social realities, maybe in an imaginary, racially more equal society in 700 years from now. Because I don't see this happening anytime soon, and I very much hope I'm wrong, but this is not where things are going. Maybe in this imaginary future, where the hermeneutic possibilities are very different, desires configure themselves differently, but desires also reflect the realities that we're in, and feeling overly guilty about them, or shaming people. I mean, how people express them, how they live them, how they play them out with other people, this all matters. But I think that, you know, race play is one of the most taboo issues, even in kink spaces, for obvious reasons. But I think there's many ways to think about these things, and I personally would encourage us to think not only about how to eliminate power. This is one of the things that you talk about, like the unevennesses of power in a dynamic, because a lot of play in an interracial relationship may not claim itself to be race play, but could be.
Actually, yeah, I know we're over time, but I love that. I love what you just said, and I feel like this is a good last thing for me to say, because I want to say something about that. So first of all, I think what you said is fully compatible with what I said. When I said that I think that we can exercise agency over our desires, I really do not want to imply that that means that all of our desires have to be morally pure, and that there's no place for these other desires. And I absolutely agree with you that it partly depends on like how you play those out and what the surroundings are. I also, as you said, really do emphasize in the book that there's no such thing as extracting our desires or our activities from the complicated and unequal power background in which they happen. That's just not a realistic goal. We are embedded in that, and so we have to imperfectly work within that. And sometimes it is really exciting and satisfying to work within that by, in good, healthy ways, indulging some of this stuff which is dark, right? Wait, I absolutely have to get our last point. I don't want to lose the very last point that I want to. Oh yes, you said in 700 years maybe. But, I actually really think never, because I think like in some.
I didn't want to be the one to say.
Yeah. But here's why it's not a bad thing, right? So like in some very abstract sense, maybe we can imagine a world without homophobia and transphobia, or a world without racism, or a world without sexism, like barely, right? These very big isms. But the power inequalities that shape every encounter we have, they're not just the big isms, right? They're things like, there's a power inequality between a couple if one person is very extroverted and has lived in the city for 10 years and has a lot of friends, and the other one is very introverted and has a smaller network. That's like actually a huge power inequality, right? Or one person has a more secure job than the other person has, or one person, is has less toxic relationships with the rest of their family. Like, there's so many power inequalities. We could like work towards utopia, and it's never going to go away. That humans are vulnerable and imperfect and finite and caught up in power. Like, that is just like, I mean, I don't really believe in human nature, but that is as fundamental to the human condition as anything is, and that's not going to go away in 700 years. So like the goal is not to jumpstart ourselves out of power or out of darkness or out of all of the ways in which things are imperfect. The goal is to like start from where we are and do our best to create a social world that holds us in our agency, and to create interpersonal interactions that hold one another in our agency in the face of our necessary vulnerability and the possibility that things will go wrong, and the fact that some things will be dark. Like, that's where the good sex is. That's not the part we're trying to get rid of. That's the human background against which it happens.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Quill. Thank you, Avgi.
Thank you.
Books are for sale. Quill will sign.
Also,
Here's
I'll
a
just
table.
hang out for a bit so we don't feel like either put on the spot or like you have to rush. Just like do your thing.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
so much.